What is up, YouTube? This is Magician34. We are on our run to Texas State Championships, and we're going to be analyzing the Lucky Delphox deck today. We're going to be talking about it in terms of three characteristics, which we're going to be using to describe all our decks on our run, which are going to be its playability, its matchups, and its overall power. And we're going to rate these things on a scale of 1 to 5. So this is the Lucky Delphox deck from earlier with a few changes like switching out one Fiery Torch for a Scorched Earth. That way you don't end up with multiple Scorched Earths which you can't get rid of. But you do have one that you can potentially use for extra uses on later turns after you play it, and you can recycle it to get rid of other stadiums and stuff like that. And some cool tricks. But yeah, you still want the others as Fiery Torches, and running the one stadium is a nice way around Seismitoad too, which is kind of a challenging matchup for us. Not as bad as you'd think because of Pyroar. And there are a few other little changes here and there, but basically it's the same old deck. In terms of ease of play, with more practice, I found that this deck is actually pretty easy to play. Once you learn the tricks, what to go for, what to search for, how to play everything out, and so on, the deck is actually remarkably easy to play. It's all about setting up Delphox and then just puking your hand out, basically. That's the short version of the story. And it is pretty easy to play, which helps our playability factor quite a bit. It means you don't have to worry about always making a super analytical game assessment. You mostly just worry about your own game rather than your opponent's side, which gives you a pretty easy situation for the most part, and that's good for us. Match length was another concern I'd had before, but honestly, with further analysis, the match length can actually be pretty quick, and because a lot of decks out there that are more in the competitive tiers are actually getting a little bit faster these days, and they're very common, so people are becoming very acquainted with how to play them, it's actually not as big a problem as it was, and shouldn't be an issue. Really shouldn't, for the most part, which is refreshing. And I'm actually pretty familiar with it. I've playtested this deck a lot against competitive and sort of rogue decks all at once. So actually for playability, I'm pleased to say this deck scores 4 out of 5, which is pretty darn good. While there's still some challenging decisions and it's not super easy to play, and sometimes you have to make hard calls about who to come up as your active Pokemon, by and large it's a pretty easy deck to play, high playability, so 4 is quite a good score. Now, in terms of our matchups, that's where we get a little bit more tricky. On the one hand, we have some very easy matchups that are pretty common. The metal decks are a very easy matchup for the most part, because most of them just get walled straight up by Pyroar. Straight up. And the only real way they have around it is using their Megas, but their Megas have to take at least one turn to get out, and because they're fire vulnerable, we can easily one-shot their Megas for the most part. And revenge killing when we don't one-shot, like on Mega Aggron, is incredibly easy. And their setup time is also a bonus for us because we sometimes take a couple of turns to set up, and they tend to as well. It's one of the slower decks. So their fire weakness is a tremendously easy, exploitable part of that matchup. And speaking of which, we also have Genesect, which is a pretty easy matchup for us, actually, while a lot of decks can struggle with Genesect. And we don't, by any means, have an auto win here. It's actually one of the easier matchups because of our Royal Command Pyroar and our Pokemon catchers. We can maneuver around Virizion early game in very interesting ways. And we deal ridiculously heavy damage and can one-shot, theoretically, anything the deck has to offer. So with any kind of a decent start, it's a very easy matchup. And even when we don't get the best of starts, these decks are still going to struggle to be able to beat us just because of our damage output alone. This deck is considerably scarier once we start getting one-hit KOs instead of two-hit KOs. So our good matchups are great matchups, and these are two decks that are pretty common, and I expect to see them. However, that said, our bad matchups are also pretty bad. Seismitoad is actually pretty neutral, so we're not going to talk about that, because Seismitoad in many ways struggles against us and gives us a lot of setup time, which is exactly what we want, and we can't really deck out. So we're not going to worry about that, and we have all sorts of creative ways around him, like Royal Command, so we're not going to worry about that. However, anything that is a fighting deck that is not just a stack of EXs, basically either Metacam or Donphan, is a very difficult matchup for us. While we do have ways around it, and our ability to one-shot some of these threats, and Donphan, Royal Command, and Pokemon Catchers can be challenging for Donphan because we can just bring up Donphans and one-shot them. If nothing else, Delphox can be a real threat to that deck because of its potential to hit for 130, 150, and so on. Still, that said, the damage output alone is scary, and Metacam is something I expect to see because it's a deck climbing in popularity pretty quickly. And I gotta say, this guy just, his ability to just go pow pow, knock things out, pow pow, knock things out, and the fact that Pyroar does like nothing to him other than, try to knock him out with a Scorching Fang, for which he'll still have to discard Fire Energy. And we only get one prize from a lot of the knockouts. It's going to be a hairy matchup. It really is. And I think in a lot of ways because of their speed factor too, that really puts that match in their favor for the most part. And if fighting is going to be a difficult matchup, Fairy is going to be an incredibly difficult matchup. Mega Gardevoir is very popular. It's a very efficient deck. The fact that our first couple of turns we usually don't do very much, Xerneas and its ability to get out and pump out energy so very consistently makes that matchup absolutely terrifying, because Mega Gardevoir EX gets around Pyroar, which of course is one of our big weaknesses, and the fact that they can just, one-shot endlessly, everything, every turn, and they've got a lot of support, and the max potions make 2-hit KOs difficult at best. It's a very challenging matchup. It's certainly winnable, but without a good start, it can be very difficult, very uphill. It's easily our worst matchup. And this is a deck we expect to see. So having our worst matchup as something that's going to be fairly common, especially at front tables, is pretty bad. It's a pretty bad spear in our side. Now I will say, as far as our neutral matchups go, which we do have to consider, overall, neutral matchups we tend to win more than we lose actually, even in the presence of megas. The cool thing is, number one, people don't know exactly what we're doing. We're kind of unpredictable, and Pyroar buys us a lot of time. And once we get going, we tend to win, even though it's not always really obvious in the game to either player sometimes. This deck tends to win games that go any kind of length, like 5 or 6 turns or more. If our opponents haven't established some significant dominance by that time, we tend to just straight up win. So as far as our matchups go, it's kind of shaky, but because our neutral matchup tends to be a winning one in my experience in playtesting, I'm going to give us a 3.5, so that's a 3.5. So 3.5 for our matchups. Because we've got some fairly common, very good matchups that are almost auto-wins, realistically, in my experience. But we can't ignore the bad matchups and how prevalent they're probably going to be too. So since we don't know the forecast, I can barely give us anything more than average as a result. It's really just our neutral matchup that pushes us above just a 3. And of course that brings us to our overall power rating. And this is the part where sadly this deck falls the most short. Is playtesting has kind of shown that a lot of the deck and its winning ability basically just comes down to those first few turns. If you get the Delphox on turn 2 or 3, you almost always win. But if it takes longer than that, it becomes pretty shaky. And we are somewhat luck dependent before we can take over and let statistics beat luck, essentially, in those first few turns. And there can be some really challenging hands where we just kind of stagnate and wait a couple of turns to draw. And as a result of that, in many ways, we can kind of beat ourselves sometimes. So the reliability is really not there. In fact, goldfishing this deck is almost the same as playing opponents a lot of times. So weighing that and weighing our matchups and everything like that, unfortunately, I gotta say, the weakness in those first few turns and the certain dependence on a decent hand and the heavy dependence on Delphox in those first few turns, while we can play around not having Delphox, it's really very crucial to a consistent game. Our overall power kind of averages out and just comes in at a 3, which means it does not look terrifically good for Lucky Delphox for regionals, but this is why we look at these things and think about them and analyze them and play test them, so that we can get a definite idea and not just be guessing at it. So anyway, that is Lucky Delphox for our run to states, and stay tuned for our analysis of other decks we're going to be trying to take to states in just about 1 week. And until then, like, comment, subscribe, and check out my channel for more cool Pokemon content.